I still return to that stretch of road sometimes, just to stand where everything I knew about time began to feel unsteady. I don't go there for answers anymore. I go because silence settles differently in that place, as if the air remembers what happened better than I do. When I close my eyes, I can still feel the faint pull of that night, cold wind brushing against my jacket, headlights drifting by, and the awareness that someone beside me carried a weight I couldn't name yet. I didn't understand it then. I'm not sure I understand it now. Back then, the world felt solid to me. Days moved forward in a straight line, predictable in their small routines. People grew older, seasons changed, and memories stayed where they belonged. But the man I met shattered that quiet logic with nothing more than the look in his eyes. There was something deeply familiar in his exhaustion, something that made me instinctively lower my voice around him, as if loud sounds might break whatever fragile thread held him together. He arrived without hurry, yet carried the urgency of someone racing against something unseen. Even before he spoke, I could sense that he wasn't just passing through. He observed the town like a person flipping through pages of a book he already knew by heart, pausing, studying, trying to place a moment he once lived. It was the way he held himself that unsettled me most. A careful posture, deliberate steps, like he was afraid of disturbing a place that no longer fully belonged to him. There were nights when I'd catch him staring down the old hill road, shoulders tense beneath his heavy coat, as if the past lived somewhere in the darkness ahead. He never said much at first, but grief tends to leak through the smallest cracks. I saw it in the way he breathed before speaking, in the way he pressed a gloved hand against his chest when the wind picked up. He wasn't lost in town. He was lost in time. And the thing that haunts me most now is simple. I stood beside him without realizing what he was truly searching for. If I had understood sooner, if I had recognized the tremor in his voice for what it was, maybe that night would sit differently in my memory. But it doesn't. It never has. And even now, decades later, the echo of his reason for coming back still follows me every time I remember the look he carried in his eyes. I first noticed the man the week the evenings began cooling down, when the sky over town shifted into that bluish shade that makes the street lamps glow warmer. He wasn't doing anything unusual, just standing near the old service station, watching the traffic roll past like someone waiting for a ride that would never come. Something about him felt out of place, though. Not suspicious, not threatening, just untethered, as if he wasn't completely settled into the moment the rest of us were living. On the second night, he appeared again at almost the exact same hour, standing on the same patch of cracked pavement. This time he nodded politely when our eyes met, but his gaze drifted past me, toward the ridge at the edge of town. It wasn't the look of a stranger admiring scenery. It was the look of someone searching for a memory that wasn't cooperating. By the third night, I felt compelled to acknowledge him. Maybe it was his posture, straight but weighed down, or the way he kept glancing at the intersection like he expected life to replay something there. When I asked if he was lost, he let out a small breath that sounded more like surrender than confusion. He said he knew the town well, just not in the way I might think. The conversation moved slowly at first. He spoke carefully, as if choosing each word required effort. But what struck me most was the familiarity in his eyes, a flicker of recognition that made no sense. I had never seen him before. At least I was certain I hadn't. It wasn't until he mentioned a specific moment, a moment he claimed happened on this very street decades ago, that I realized he wasn't here to find a place. He was here to find a younger version of himself. And by the hesitation in his voice, I sensed that whatever he hoped to witness would reshape more than just his own understanding of that day. Hi, my name is Mark. If you're enjoying this story so far, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. It helps a lot. Have you ever wondered what you might say to your younger self if you had the chance? Thank you for being here and listening. Now let's return to the story. I didn't know what I expected to hear after he admitted he was looking for a younger version of himself. Maybe a laugh, maybe a confession that he was joking or confused or grieving someone who only resembled him. But Daniel didn't seem like a man who used exaggeration to get attention. His voice carried a kind of quiet certainty, the kind that grows from years of holding tight to a truth no one else would ever believe. We stood under the street lamp, its warm glow catching the edges of his coat. A breeze moved between us, carrying the faint scent of cold asphalt and the distant hum of late-night traffic. Daniel didn't look at me as he spoke. His eyes stayed fixed on the ridge past the road, as if he were already seeing something I couldn't, a memory layered over the present. He used to walk down this hill every evening, Daniel murmured, right after work. Always took the long way home. Said it helped him clear his mind. You mean you? I said before I could stop myself. He nodded slowly, not correcting me. The silence that followed felt deliberate, like he wanted the weight of those words to settle before continuing. I took a cautious step closer. If you're here for him, for your younger self, why now? Why this day? He pressed a gloved hand against the side of his coat, where the fabric was worn thinner than the rest. I noticed then that his glove didn't match the weather. The night was chilly, but not enough to explain why he wore only one. He exhaled through his nose, steady, tired. Some days, he said, split your life in two, before and after. You don't see it at the time, not really. You only understand much later. He swallowed. I came back to stand on the line between those two halves. A part of me wanted to challenge him, to ask what he meant by came back. But there was something fragile about him, something that warned me not to push too hard. He wasn't asking me to believe him. He wasn't asking anything at all. He was simply telling me what he knew. The street was quiet except for a single car passing in the distance, its headlights sliding along the pavement like slow-moving stars. Daniel watched the light fade, his breath forming a thin cloud that dissolved before it reached his shoulder. He looked like a man waiting for a train that only he could see. "Where is he now?" I asked softly. Daniel blinked, almost as if waking from a long thought. "Not far, 17 years old. Too proud to admit he's scared. Too stubborn to imagine he could be wrong about anything." For the first time that night, a faint smile touched his lips, brief and worn. I remember him so clearly it aches. "Are you here to talk to him?" I asked. "To warn him about something?" His smile faded. "No, I can't interfere. I'm only here to witness it, to let the moment be what it was. Then what changes?" He shook his head. "Nothing. Not for him, anyway." There was an emphasis on that last phrase that caught in my mind. Not for him. I didn't know what that meant, but something in it felt heavy, personal, and unspoken. I started to ask, but Daniel turned his face toward the ridge again, the muscles along his jaw tightening as if bracing for impact. "He'll walk down that hill any minute now," he said. "You'll hear his footsteps before you see him." I instinctively looked toward the ridge, even though I knew I wouldn't see anything yet. The road curved at the top, disappearing behind a cluster of trees. The night felt still, expectant. "Why tell me any of this?" I asked. "You don't even know me." Daniel's voice lowered, almost swallowed by the cold air. "Because someone should remember this the way it truly happened, and I can't trust my own memory anymore." The words unsettled me more than I cared to admit. His gaze remained fixed on the hill, and when I followed it, I felt the first stirrings of unease, an intuition that something was shifting, something small but undeniable. The street looked the same, the night felt the same, yet there was a quiet tension in the air, like the moment before a storm when the world holds its breath. Then Daniel whispered, "Listen." And for the first time I heard the faint rhythm of footsteps descending the hill. At first, the footsteps blended with the wind, soft, uneven taps that rose and faded, as if the night were testing its own echo. But then the rhythm steadied, becoming unmistakably human. Daniel straightened, not with excitement, but with a deep, quiet resignation. It was the posture of a man preparing to relive a memory rather than meet a person. I felt my own pulse quicken. There was no reason to be nervous, yet I was. Something about the stillness around us made the ordinary feel fragile, as though the slightest movement could break the shape of whatever was unfolding. Daniel didn't move. He just listened. When the figure appeared at the crest of the road, he was little more than a shadow cast between the trees. But his pace, confident, tired, familiar, matched the rhythm Daniel had described. As he drew closer, the street lamp revealed more. A young man with a blue jacket, soft hair brushing his forehead, and the restless energy of someone who hasn't yet learned to fear the future. Daniel let out a shallow breath. "That's him," he whispered. 17, thinking he knows what he's walking toward. I studied the teenager, Danny, trying to match him to the lines of the older man beside me. The resemblance was there, but muted, as though time had taken the same face and carved it into something sharper, more fragile. Danny's steps were quick, distracted, the kind of hurried walk boys adopt when they want to appear casual but are anxious to be somewhere else. "What happens tonight?" I murmured. Daniel didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the boy, tracking every slight shift in posture, every tilt of his head. Not with curiosity, Daniel already knew each detail, but with the aching awareness of someone revisiting a closed chapter. Danny slowed near the intersection, glancing toward the convenience store across the street. For a moment, I thought he might come closer to us, but he stayed on his side of the road, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. He didn't seem to notice us at all. Why would he? To him, we were just two strangers on a quiet night. Daniel took a small step forward, not enough to draw attention, but enough that I sensed the conflict rising in him. The desire to speak, the need to remain silent. His gloved hand hovered inches from his coat, curling and uncurling with the smallest tremor. "He can't hear me," Daniel said softly. "Even if I spoke, it wouldn't reach him." "You mean he won't listen?" "I mean the moment won't let him." His voice had an edge of sorrow. "Some moments are fixed by who we were, not who we become." Danny crossed his arms tightly, as if bracing against the cold, though the breeze had softened. He looked toward the ridge, squinting into the night as though searching for something or someone. It struck me then that he seemed unsettled, like he wasn't sure if he should continue home or turn back. A teenager caught between impulse and hesitation. Daniel inhaled sharply. "This is it." "What is?" The pause right before he decides. His words barely rose above a whisper. "I remember thinking the world felt heavier that night, but I didn't understand why. I only felt pulled, like something ahead was waiting for me, whether I wanted it or not." I studied Danny again, searching for any sign of significance. Nothing obvious presented itself. He didn't seem aware of a turning point. He looked like any young man on any ordinary night. Indecisive, impatient, unsure of why everything felt different, even though nothing had changed. Daniel stepped back, the motion barely perceptible. His jaw tightened. He's about to choose. Danny exhaled long and slow, then shifted his weight, subtle, almost invisible, and turned down the path leading toward the old rail yard. Not toward home, not toward safety, toward something else entirely. Daniel's shoulders sagged. There it is. I wanted to ask what that choice meant, what it set in motion, but the words lodged in my throat. The air felt thick, charged. Danny walked farther, fading into the dim light near the bend, unaware of the two men watching him. One stranger and one future self, carrying the burden of a night the boy had not yet lived. Daniel stared after him, unmoving, as if waiting for the past to acknowledge him. It didn't. Daniel didn't speak for a long moment after Danny disappeared down the bend. He kept his gaze fixed on the curve of the road, the faint glow of the street lamp barely reaching that far. The emptiness left in the boy's absence felt heavier than his presence ever could have. I sensed that the memory Daniel carried wasn't just vivid, it was unfinished, as though watching it again reopened something he had spent years trying to quiet. He never understood what pushed him that way, Daniel finally said. Not then. Do you? I asked. His answer came slowly. I thought I did. For a long time I believed it was choice, free will, some stubborn belief that I'd been meant to walk toward that place, at that hour. He paused, then added, but standing here now, I'm not sure. Maybe it was simply the weight of being 17. We stood in silence, the night deepening around us. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, then again. Cars had become scarce on the road behind us, and even the wind seemed to hesitate. A quiet town at rest, yet nothing about the moment felt restful. What happens next? I asked. Daniel closed his eyes as if collecting pieces of a memory too sharp to touch directly. He'll go to the rail yard. He doesn't know why. He just feels drawn to it. There's something there. Something he wants without knowing what it is. I frowned. And you came back just to watch him make that choice again? Daniel didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was softer. Watching is the only thing I'm allowed to do. There was a coldness to that statement, not from the temperature, but from the ache beneath it. A man who had already lived the consequences of that night was now bound to observing it like a passenger in his own life. Did something happen to him? I asked cautiously. No, he said. Something happened to me. He turned away from the road then, just slightly, enough for the light to catch the side of his face. In that sliver of illumination, the years etched into his features looked deeper, as if the past had carved him more than time alone could explain. Danny's choice, whatever it was, had changed Daniel, not the other way around. And though I didn't understand it fully, I sensed that the wound wasn't the kind that healed cleanly. "Why can't you speak to him?" I asked. "If you're already here, what harm is there in trying?" Daniel lifted his gloved hand again, almost reflexively, as though checking it for warmth or pulse. Talking to him wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't land. The moment belongs to him, not me. His eyes lowered. Besides, he wouldn't believe who I was. I thought about that, about how impossible it would be for a teenage version of oneself to accept the presence of a future self without unraveling. The idea alone felt too large, too fragile for the world to hold. Daniel breathed in deeply, then let the air slip out slowly. The boy I once was, he had no room for doubt, no room for fear. He moved like every step was his first and last at the same time. There's no reaching someone like that. "Then why come back at all?" I asked. Daniel opened his eyes, and for the first time, he looked directly at me. There was no anger in his expression, only a tired sincerity. Because it wasn't until years later that I realized why that night mattered. I can't change what happened, but I can stand here and acknowledge it. Sometimes that's enough. The simplicity of the answer struck me harder than anything he had said before. He wasn't here to correct his past or rewrite his mistakes. He was here to honor something: loss, regret, memory, or maybe the last moment he recognized himself. The wind stirred again, brushing loose gravel across the pavement. Daniel glanced down the path Danny had taken, then stepped away from the street lamp's glow. "We should go," he said quietly. "He's gone far enough that we won't catch up, and he needs to be alone for what comes next." There was a finality in his tone, not fear, not dread, but acceptance. I followed him without knowing why, a shadow trailing the man who had returned from a year I couldn't imagine and a memory I couldn't yet understand. Daniel walked ahead of me with a calmness that didn't match the weight of the moment we had just witnessed. His steps were steady, unhurried, like he had rehearsed this road 1,000 times in his mind long before ever returning here. I followed a few paces behind, not wanting to disturb whatever quiet resolve guided him now. The night had settled into a deeper stillness. Even the trees lining the road seemed to lean inward, listening. "Do you remember the rail yard the way it was back then?" he asked without turning around. "I remember it well enough," I said. "It hasn't changed much." "It has," he replied softly. "Not in structure, in feeling." I wasn't sure what he meant, but something in his tone suggested that the place carried a different weight for him, one I couldn't sense yet. We continued down the sidewalk toward the narrow gravel path that led behind the hardware store, a shortcut locals used to reach the yard. Daniel slowed just before stepping onto it, letting his hand brush the wooden post at the corner as if testing its solidity. "He went this way," he murmured. "Always took the quieter path. Said the noise of the main road made him anxious." "You talk about him like he's someone else," I said. Daniel stopped walking. For a moment I thought he hadn't heard me, but then he turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see the shadow of conflict tightening his jaw. "He was someone else," Daniel said. "Someone I don't always recognize." He resumed walking before I could reply. His figure moved between pockets of shadow, the single glove on his left hand catching the faint light when he lifted it to steady himself on uneven ground. The glove still puzzled me, its presence, its purpose, but I kept the question to myself. The path opened to the edge of the rail yard where rusted freight cars rested on idle tracks. Grass grew tall around the wheels, swaying faintly in the breeze. The place had always felt abandoned, but under the wash of moonlight it looked almost frozen in time, untouched and unreachable. Daniel breathed out slowly, as if bracing himself. "He'll be near the far car," Daniel said. "He used to sit there when he needed space. Said it made him feel small in a good way." We approached the area, careful with our steps. Gravel crunched underfoot, each sound too loud in the otherwise perfect quiet. Daniel paused before rounding the corner of the nearest car, his shoulders lifting and falling in a deliberate breath. I realized then that every inch of this moment mattered to him, not just the memory but the act of reliving it. When he finally stepped around the corner, he stopped abruptly. Danny wasn't there. Daniel's body tensed, a subtle tightening that ran from his shoulders down through his legs. His gaze scanned the shadows, Not with panic, but with a careful precision that suggested he was checking the memory against the present, searching for the smallest discrepancy. "He should be here," Daniel whispered. "This is where he always sat." "Maybe he changed something tonight," I offered. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No, he doesn't know enough yet to change anything." I felt a flicker of unease then, a sensation that something small had shifted beneath the surface of the night. Not enough to call wrong, but enough to feel off. Daniel walked closer to the car, his hand brushing its cold metal side. He leaned slightly, peering along the tracks. "He might have gone farther down," Daniel said, though his voice lacked conviction. Before either of us moved, a faint metallic clatter echoed from somewhere deeper in the yard. Not loud, but distinct, like a foot slipping on loose gravel or brushing against abandoned rail ties. Daniel turned toward the sound with a sharpness I hadn't seen in him before. "That's him," he said. "It has to be." I followed his gaze. The moonlight thinned in that direction, swallowed by the shapes of old storage sheds. The air felt cooler, heavier, as though whatever waited beyond the darkness carried its own temperature. Daniel stepped forward, slower this time, each movement deliberate. "He never went this far," he whispered. "Not that night." There was fear in his voice now, but not fear for himself, fear for the boy he once was. Daniel hesitated at the edge of the darker section of the yard, as if crossing into it required more than simple courage. The faint clatter that had drawn our attention had already faded, swallowed by the stillness that lingered between the abandoned sheds. I watched his expression shift, not confusion, not doubt, but a kind of wary recognition, as if some part of him had always known the past might not play out exactly as he remembered. "He never came this way," Daniel murmured again, softer this time, more to himself than to me. "Not that night, not in my memory." "Maybe your memory's just blurred," I suggested, though the words felt thin as soon as I spoke them. Everything about Daniel's presence, his certainty, his restraint, his exhaustion, made it hard to believe he'd confused something so important. He didn't answer. His eyes narrowed slightly, tracking something invisible ahead of us. After a moment, he stepped forward and I followed, the two of us moving between the tall shadows cast by the freight cars. Gravel shifted under our shoes, echoing louder than I wanted it to. The darkness seemed to thicken the farther we went, not in color but in sensation, like walking into a place the night had claimed more completely than the rest of the world. We reached the row of sheds, their metal siding dented by years of storms. A thin draft slipped between them, carrying the faint scent of oil and rust. Daniel stopped abruptly. I nearly bumped into him but caught myself in time. His shoulders had stiffened, his breathing quickened just enough to notice. "What is it?" I whispered. He raised his gloved hand slightly, a small gesture for silence. Then he tilted his head, listening. At first I heard nothing, but after a few seconds a soft sound emerged, barely there, scraping, like fabric brushing against wood. Someone was nearby. Daniel stepped closer to the shed, moving with a caution that seemed instinctive, practiced. He reached the edge of the structure and rested his fingertips lightly against the cold metal, peering around the corner. His reaction was immediate but controlled. A sharp inhale, a tightening around his eyes, a subtle but unmistakable tremor in his posture. I leaned just enough to see what had frozen him. Danny stood several yards away, half hidden in the dimness between two sheds. He wasn't sitting as Daniel expected. He wasn't pacing or brooding or looking for a quiet place to think. Instead, he was crouched low, examining something on the ground. His posture was tense, his focus absolute. "What is he doing?" I whispered. Daniel didn't answer. He stared at the boy with an expression that was painful to witness, recognition tangled with dread. Danny shifted slightly, revealing more of what he was looking at. A small object lay in the gravel, dark, metallic, catching a faint sliver of moonlight. It wasn't large, could have been anything. A piece of scrap metal, a broken tool, a lock or chain fragment left behind by workers years ago. But Daniel reacted as though he knew exactly what it was. "No," Daniel whispered, barely audible. "Not tonight. Not here." The intensity in his voice startled me. He had been composed until now, accepting, resigned. But this moment broke that calm. Something about what Danny found, or was about to find, cut through Daniel's practiced distance from the past. "Daniel," I said quietly, "what is that? What did he find?" He shook his head, eyes never leaving the boy. "He shouldn't be touching it," He shouldn't even be near it. But why? What is it? Daniel took a slow breath, steadying himself. It's nothing dangerous, not in the way you're thinking, but it matters. It mattered to him that night in a way I never understood until much later. Danny picked up the object, turning it over in his hand. His brow furrowed, his expression shifting from curiosity to something else. Something heavier. Daniel exhaled shakily. This wasn't supposed to happen here. The certainty in his voice chilled me. Then where was it supposed to happen? I asked. Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back from the shed and placed a hand against his forehead, as though trying to steady a memory that had suddenly begun to blur or fracture. He's changing the night without knowing he's changing it, Daniel whispered. The words hung in the air, fragile and frightening. Because if the night was shifting now, then Daniel's memory was no longer the only thing at risk. Daniel stayed very still, as if movement itself might push the night further off course. His hand remained pressed against his forehead, fingers curled slightly, not in pain, but in disbelief. I had seen him unsettled before, but this was different. This was a man watching the ground shift beneath a memory he had trusted for decades. Danny turned the small metal object over in his hand again, brushing dirt from its surface. The moonlight caught the edge of it just long enough for me to see a faint glimmer. Whatever it was, it seemed old. Older than the boy holding it. Older than the yard itself. What happens if he keeps it? I asked quietly. Daniel lowered his hand, but didn't look at me. Nothing immediate. Nothing obvious. It's the meaning that changes, not the moment. What meaning? Daniel finally turned his gaze toward me. His eyes looked tired, even more than before. There's a version of this night where he never finds that object, where he walks past it without noticing, where the world stays predictable. He paused. But there's also a version where he finds it, and everything after feels different in ways he won't understand for years. I struggled to follow his logic. So he's not ruining anything by picking it up? No, Daniel said. He's just bending something, changing how he remembers the night later. He drew a slow breath. Memory is fragile, even without time involved. Danny stood up then, closing his fingers around the object. He slipped it into his jacket pocket and scanned the yard, his expression shifting into something unsettled, like the sudden weight of an emotion he didn't have the vocabulary to name yet. You're worried, I said. Daniel didn't deny it. I came back to witness a moment, not a variation of it. His voice tightened. I thought watching it again would bring clarity, but seeing him choose differently, it brings the opposite. Isn't that part of memory? I asked. Thinking you know the shape of a night until you see it from another angle? Daniel gave a faint, tired smile. Maybe, but I didn't expect the past to move under my feet. We watched Danny walk farther between the sheds, his steps cautious now. He paused near a pile of old rail ties, glancing back toward the direction he came. His shoulders lifted slightly, a small intake of breath, as if part of him sensed he wasn't alone. My heartbeat quickened. Can he feel us? I whispered. No, Daniel said firmly. Not consciously. Then his expression changed. But he always had a strange sensitivity to the world. He noticed patterns before he noticed people, moments before he noticed consequences. That sounds like you, I said. Daniel shook his head gently. That sounds like who he used to be. People change. Danny crouched again, running his hand across the rough wood of the rail ties, searching for something he didn't seem to fully understand. The object in his pocket weighed on him, not physically, but emotionally, as though holding it had stirred a feeling he wasn't ready to face. What did that thing become for you? I asked. Daniel's silence spoke louder than any answer. After several moments, he said quietly, a reminder of what I didn't see coming, and what I carried too far. Danny straightened then, distracted by a sound we didn't hear. He looked toward the open yard, toward the faint glow of the main road in the distance. His posture stiffened, not in fear, but in decision. He's leaving, Daniel whispered. Sure enough, Danny began walking back the way he came, but slower this time, his hand brushing his jacket pocket, as if ensuring the object was still there. His steps were thoughtful, heavy in a way a 17-year-old's steps shouldn't be. He wasn't supposed to leave this quickly, Daniel said, more to himself than to me. This night was longer in my memory. What does that mean? It means, Daniel said softly, we're not just watching the past, we're watching it rewrite itself. The wind shifted suddenly, cold enough to raise goosebumps along my arms. The yard seemed to darken, not from the loss of light, but from the subtle sense that timelines, memories, possibilities were adjusting around us like quiet machinery. Danny didn't look back as he walked away, but Daniel did, not toward the boy, toward the empty space the past had just reshaped. Danny's footsteps faded into the distance, but the echo of them lingered inside the rail yard, as if the night wasn't ready to release the sound. The air settled slowly after he disappeared, like dust drifting back into place after something heavy had been lifted. Daniel stayed still for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dark path the boy had taken, as if watching a thread slip through his fingers. He left earlier than he should have, Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. You said this night felt longer. I reminded him. Maybe it's just memory stretching it. No, he said quietly. Memory collapses things, compresses years into scenes. A long night becomes a single image. A short moment becomes an entire story. But this, he exhaled, troubled. This is different. He's behaving differently. He stepped away from the shed, placing a steadying hand against the chipped metal. The glove made a soft scrape as it slid down the surface. He looked almost unbalanced for a second, not physically, but emotionally, as if the ground beneath the version of his past had shifted while he stood on it. We should follow him, Daniel said. I need to see where the deviation ends. The deviation, I repeated. Daniel nodded, already moving. Every choice branches. Most of them lead back to the same place eventually. But some, he paused, searching for words, some widen. I didn't fully understand, but the urgency in his voice left no room for hesitation. I followed him out of the narrow corridor between the sheds and back toward the open stretch of the yard. The gravel crunched beneath our feet, sharper now, almost brittle. The moon was lower than before, resting closer to the tree line, its light dimmer and more fragile. Where do you think he's going? I asked. He doesn't know, Daniel said. Not consciously, but he feels unsettled. That object, finding it this early, shifted something in him. What object? I asked again, unable to ignore the question any longer. You keep talking around it. What did he actually pick up? Daniel slowed until he stopped entirely. He looked toward the path Danny had taken, jaw clenched in quiet conflict. After a long moment, he said, it was part of a lock, a small one, old, rusted, nothing remarkable to anyone else. His voice deepened, but it belonged to someone who became very important to him. Later. So finding it tonight changes how he remembers her? I asked. Daniel's eyes flickered with something heavy. Memory, regret, maybe recognition of a truth he had spent years trying to soften. It changes where the memory begins, he whispered. And that small shift, it ripples. He didn't say more. Instead, he resumed walking, though slower now, almost cautiously. The yard gave way to a narrow path lined with tall weeds, the kind that sway with even the softest breeze. The night was colder here, not by temperature, but by presence, as if we were walking deeper into a memory that wasn't meant to be reopened. He was emotional that year, Daniel continued. Angry, lonely, convinced the world was smaller than the pain he carried. He shook his head. That piece of metal wasn't magic. It didn't alter his fate. But it reminded him of something, someone, that he didn't fully understand yet. And now? I asked. And now he found it too soon. I frowned. Too soon for what? For the person he would become, Daniel said. We reached the end of the path where the yard tapered into a stretch of cracked asphalt behind a shuttered warehouse. Danny's footprints weren't visible, but Daniel walked as if pulled by familiarity, tracing the memory of a route he had once taken. He'll stop somewhere near the loading dock, Daniel murmured. He always paused there, to think, to breathe before going home. There was something tender in the way he said it, a softness not present before. I sensed the part of him that still carried affection for the boy he once was, even with all the disappointment layered over it. But when we rounded the corner of the warehouse, the loading dock sat empty. The shadows were untouched, the night unbroken. He didn't stop, Daniel said, his voice thin. He walked past. That never happened before. The unease that had been trailing us finally caught up, settling into the silence around us. What does that mean? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Daniel took a step back, his breath unsteady. It means the night is no longer matching the memory. And then, in a voice quieter than the wind moving through the weeds, he added, "And I don't know where he's going anymore." Daniel stood at the edge of the loading dock as if the empty space there contradicted something fundamental inside him. His eyes moved slowly across the concrete, the shadows, the far stretch of cracked pavement, searching for an echo of the memory he once trusted. When he didn't find it, something in his posture shifted. Not panic, not fear, but a deep, quiet displacement. "He always stopped here," Daniel said softly. This was the moment he hesitated, the moment he almost turned back home. "What made him stop?" I asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe nothing. Maybe everything." He ran a hand across the worn railing, fingertips brushing rust. It was the first time he sensed the weight of his own life. The first time he realized he was capable of hurting someone without meaning to. I didn't know how to respond. The sincerity in Daniel's voice was raw, unfiltered, the kind that only appears when a person is walking through an old wound they thought they'd numbed. He stepped down from the dock and began walking along the side of the warehouse, where the asphalt met a narrow strip of overgrown grass. "If he didn't stop here," Daniel continued, "then he's following a version of the night that doesn't belong to me." "What does that even mean?" I asked, trying to keep up with the pace of his thoughts. Daniel paused mid-step. "I came back because I thought witnessing the moment again would help me understand it. But if he's changing pieces of it, if he's responding differently, then I'm not witnessing my memory anymore. I'm witnessing something new." The idea unsettled me more than I expected. I had always thought of the past as a fixed, silent place, unreachable and unmoving. But watching Daniel struggle to reconcile the night with the memory of it made time feel thin, like a curtain that could shift if someone pulled too hard on the fabric. We followed the curve behind the warehouse, stepping over broken glass and loose stones. Ahead, the path opened into a small clearing where the light from a distant street lamp struggled to reach. The air felt heavier here, colder, as though the night had grown wary of what we were chasing. Daniel slowed until he came to a stop beside an old utility pole marked with fading paint. He lifted his chin slightly, listening. "He's close," Daniel said. "How do you know?" "Because this place..." He hesitated, then exhaled. This place mattered, even if I never understood why. Before I could ask what he meant, a faint sound drifted through the clearing, soft, rhythmic, uneven. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Someone catching their breath after running or crying or simply trying to steady themselves. We moved carefully toward the sound, keeping close to the shadows until the shape of a person emerged near the base of a fence. It was Danny. He sat with his knees drawn up, one hand pressed to his forehead, the other resting over the pocket where he had hidden the object he found. He looked shaken, not scared, not hurt, just deeply, visibly unsettled in a way I didn't recognize from earlier that night. Daniel's breath hitched quietly. "He broke here," he whispered. "I never remembered that." Danny lifted his head slightly, staring up at the sky as though searching for something he couldn't name. The moonlight touched his face, revealing eyes glistening, not from tears, but from confusion, from a kind of emotional weight he wasn't prepared to carry. "What is he feeling?" I asked softly. Daniel's answer took time. The beginning of something, the edge of a moment he'll spend years trying to understand. He swallowed, and the loneliness of realizing no one can help him through it. Danny stood abruptly, brushing dirt from his jeans. He glanced around, anxious, then began walking toward the chain-link fence at the far end of the clearing. "He's going the wrong way," Daniel said, startled. "He never went that way." "Is that a problem?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he watched the boy move deeper into the dark. Finally he said, "I don't know." And that uncertainty, spoken by a man who had already lived the night once, settled over the clearing like a quiet, growing shadow. Danny moved along the fence with a determined, almost restless pace, trailing his fingers across the chain links as though testing their strength. The faint rattle of metal followed him, soft but sharp enough to snag the quiet. Daniel and I kept our distance, staying between the shadows, cast by the warehouse and the low shrubs near the clearing. Every movement the boy made seemed heavier than it should have been, as if he was dragging something unseen with him. "He shouldn't be going that way," Daniel murmured again, but this time it wasn't confusion in his voice. It was recognition, tinged with something close to regret. "What's down there?" I asked. Nothing, he said. Then, after a beat, nothing he was meant to find tonight. We watched as Danny reached the far corner of the yard where the fence bent inward, creating a narrow space between metal and concrete. A forgotten alcove. One of those unremarkable places that becomes meaningful only because someone once stood there long enough for the memory to latch on. Danny hesitated in the opening, glancing over his shoulder as if the night itself might be watching him. His breath fogged faintly in the cold air. Then he slipped into the gap. Daniel stiffened. "This is wrong," he whispered. He never stepped inside. "What's in there?" I asked again, quieter this time. Daniel didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the dark slit in the fence where the younger version of himself had vanished. I saw something flicker across his face then, a kind of fear that wasn't about danger but about truth, about seeing something he had once forgotten, or once chosen not to remember. Without a word, Daniel started forward. I followed quickly, the gravel crunching under my feet. The closer we came to the fence, the colder the air grew, as if the shadowed space trapped not just darkness but time itself. Daniel reached the alcove and stopped just short of entering. He peered inside, his breath catching on something he saw. I leaned beside him. Danny stood in the narrow space, his back to us. His hands were braced against the concrete wall, his forehead resting between them. His shoulders trembled slightly, not from cold, but from something internal that had risen too quickly for him to manage. "He's overwhelmed," Daniel whispered. "He doesn't know why. He thinks it's just the night, or the loneliness, or that object in his pocket." He exhaled shakily. "But it's more than that. He's touching something he's not ready for." Danny lowered one hand to his pocket and pressed against the outline of the object, gripping it tightly. His breath hitched. "What is he feeling?" I asked quietly. "What did that thing bring back?" Daniel closed his eyes, his voice trembling just enough to break the steady tone he'd maintained all night. "Loss," he said, "but he doesn't know it yet. The object belonged to someone he hasn't met, someone who will matter to him more than he'll ever be able to admit." I felt the weight of the revelation settle between us, thick and cold. Danny straightened then, wiping his forehead, though there were no tears, just confusion, just the trembling pressure of a feeling that had arrived too early, without context. He turned slightly, and for a moment I thought he might sense us. His eyes drifted along the fence as though following a sound only he could hear. A shiver moved along his spine. Daniel held perfectly still. After a long pause, Danny pulled his jacket tighter around himself and stepped back out of the alcove. His movements were steadier now, but his expression carried a subtle strain, like he had glimpsed something he didn't yet have the words for. "He's leaving," Daniel whispered. Danny began walking toward the open stretch of the yard again, heading in a direction he hadn't taken in Daniel's memory. Not toward home, not toward the path he had followed in the original night. "He's drifting," Daniel said. "The meaning of the night is shifting under him, under me." "Is that dangerous?" I asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He watched the boy fade into the dim light, his eyes filled not with fear, but with a painful understanding. "Only if he carries tonight with him the wrong way," Daniel finally said. "And does he?" I asked. Daniel looked down, the glove on his hand tightening into a fist. "He will." Danny moved toward the open stretch of the yard with the uncertain gait of someone walking through fog, each step forward made out of instinct rather than intention. The night around him felt different now, taut somehow, as if the air resisted his movement. Daniel followed at a distance, his shoulders drawn tight beneath his coat, the single glove on his left hand brushing the side of his leg with each step. I stayed close behind, sensing that whatever we were walking into wasn't just part of his memory. It was part of something he had tried to leave behind. "He doesn't know where he's going," Daniel murmured, more to himself than to me. "He thinks he's looking for a place to think, but he's really looking for a feeling he doesn't understand yet." "A feeling brought on by that object?" I asked. Daniel gave a faint nod. "It's not the object itself. It's what it stands for. Even without knowing its history, he feels the weight of it. It's the first time he senses the outline of a future he can't name." We reached the far side of the yard where the gravel thinned into patches of dry earth. Ahead of us, Danny stopped near a section of torn fencing. Beyond it lay the old utility path, a narrow trail that ran parallel to the tracks before cutting into a wooded area behind the industrial lots. It was darker there, more isolated, a place where street lamps didn't bother shining. Daniel slowed. His breath formed a thin cloud in the cool air. I know this path. I walked it 100 times, but never on this night. Before Daniel could decide whether to follow, Danny slipped through the gap in the fence and stepped onto the path. The faint crunch of twigs under his shoes carried back to us, oddly resonant in the quiet. Daniel's jaw tightened. He's following something he shouldn't be following. What do you mean? Daniel didn't answer immediately. He rubbed his forehead with the back of his gloved hand, as if trying to steady a memory that blurred each time we drifted farther from what he recognized. He's not walking into danger, Daniel finally said. Not the kind you're thinking of. He's walking toward a realization he wasn't supposed to have tonight. The path narrowed as we followed it. Dead leaves scattered under our feet. The silhouettes of bare branches stretched overhead like ribs of some enormous sleeping creature. Danny walked with his hands in his pockets now, his shoulders hunched, the outline of his figure flickering in and out of the tree's shadows. He's hurting, Daniel said softly. He doesn't know why, but he feels something breaking open inside him, something he won't understand for a long time. I watched Danny pause ahead of us. He stood still, staring at the ground the way a person stares at the last piece of a dream they're trying to hold on to before it slips away. What was this night supposed to be? I asked gently. A moment of hesitation, Daniel said. A small bruise on an otherwise forgettable year. He was meant to go home with an ache he couldn't explain. An ache that would make sense later when he met her. Her. The word hung in the air like a breath caught between two memories. The girl the object belonged to? I asked. Daniel didn't speak at first. His eyes softened, the sadness in them deepening in a way that felt older than the night itself. Yes, he said at last. He didn't know her yet. Not this year. Not for a while. He took a slow breath. But the object belonged to her. And finding it early, it means he's feeling the shadow of a grief he has no name for yet. So he's sensing a future heartbreak. He's sensing a future connection. Daniel corrected. And connections that matter always carry their own shadow. A sudden gust rustled the branches above us. Danny turned his head sharply, as if jolted from a thought too heavy for his age. Then he began walking again, this time with more speed, more urgency, as though he were being pulled by something just out of reach. Daniel exhaled shakily. This is where things begin to drift beyond what I lived. What happens next? I asked. Daniel's voice trembled just enough to reveal the truth he'd been circling all night. I don't know. He watched his younger self vanish deeper down the darkened path. And that, he said quietly, terrifies me more than anything I expected to find here. Danny's silhouette slipped deeper into the trees, moving along the narrow track as though following a thread only he could see. The path dipped slightly, curving between clusters of tall pines whose branches pressed inward, filtering the moonlight into thin, uneven stripes. Daniel slowed as we entered the shaded bend, his eyes fixed on the faint shape ahead, his breaths growing shallower, as if the night itself had become hard to inhale. He shouldn't be feeling this much, Daniel murmured. Not tonight. Not yet. What exactly is he feeling? I asked. Daniel hesitated, searching for words that didn't seem to come easily. The beginning of attachment, he said finally. The kind that arrives before you even know what it means, and the beginning of the loss that follows it. I studied the path Danny had taken. He doesn't know her yet, I said carefully. You told me that. He doesn't, Daniel confirmed. But that object he found, that piece of the lock, it belonged to a moment he hasn't lived, and some things. His voice softened. Some emotions don't care about the order in which they're supposed to arrive. We continued forward, the ground softer underfoot now, padded with pine needles. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and cold bark. Ahead, Danny slowed near a fallen tree trunk and lowered himself onto it, elbows resting on his knees, staring down at the patch of ground between his shoes. He didn't move for a long time. Daniel stopped several steps behind him, the two of us remaining hidden by a thin stand of young pines. The stillness around us felt fragile, like a layer of frost that might crack under too much sound. I forget how young he was, Daniel whispered. I remember the anger, the impatience, the way everything felt like an open wound. But I forget how lost he really was. I watched Danny's shoulders rise and fall with uneven breaths. His hand moved instinctively to his jacket pocket again. He pressed the outline of the object there as if searching for warmth or clarity. What did the lock belong to? I asked. Why does it hit him so hard? Daniel's jaw tightened. A box, he said. She carried it everywhere, Years later, he'd open it and understand why. But right now, he's feeling the weight of a connection he hasn't made yet. He swallowed hard. That kind of ache doesn't have a name when you're 17. The wind shifted, brushing through the trees in a hush that made the clearing feel even quieter. Danny leaned forward, rubbing his forehead. A sound escaped him, soft, frustrated, like a boy realizing for the first time that something inside him was too heavy to outrun. Daniel's shoulders pulled inward. "I didn't remember him breaking like this," he said. "I thought he kept walking. I thought he faced the night without stopping." His voice grew strained. "Memory protects you from the parts you're not ready to carry, or it reshapes them," I said gently. Daniel glanced at me, the lines beside his eyes deepening. "Or it lies," he admitted. Ahead of us, Danny stood abruptly, as though propelled by a sudden decision. But instead of heading back toward town, he turned along the deeper section of the trail, the part that led to the old service road behind the mill, a place darker than the rest of the woods, rarely used even in daylight. Daniel inhaled sharply. "No," he whispered. "That's not part of the night. He never went there. Not once." "Are you sure?" Daniel didn't answer. He watched the boy disappear into the narrow corridor of shadows between the trees, his gloved hand trembling slightly. Something had shifted, not just in the night, but in Daniel's understanding of it. The more we followed, the more it felt like we weren't witnessing a memory at all. We were witnessing a possibility, one Daniel had never lived. "He's walking toward something he wasn't meant to experience tonight," Daniel said, stepping forward as though pulled. "I don't know what it is." We followed the boy into the deeper part of the woods, the trees closing around us, the trail narrowing into something that felt less like a path and more like a boundary. The cold thickened. The silence tightened. Daniel slowed again, his voice barely audible. "I thought I came back to remember." He swallowed. "But maybe I came back to learn what I forgot." The deeper we followed the narrowing trail, the more the woods seemed to draw inward around us. Branches arched overhead like the ribs of some ancient structure, their shadows stitching into a patchwork of dim light and near dark. Danny's figure moved steadily ahead, but with a strange hesitance, as if each step both pulled him forward and warned him back. Daniel stayed only a few paces behind him. His breaths had grown shallow, almost careful, as though breathing too loudly might fracture the fragile thread of the moment. I could sense something shifting in him, a tension drawn tight between memory and discovery. He wasn't just following his younger self anymore. He was bracing for something he had never allowed himself to see. Danny stopped when the trail opened into a clearing I barely recognized. The trees curved around it in a loose semicircle, leaving a patch of open ground where the moonlight fell in an uneven, pale wash. The old mill road lay beyond, faint but visible, stretching out like a thin scar between the trees. I had never known anyone to come out here at night. Even during the day, most people avoided the path except for dog walkers and the occasional hiker. Danny stepped forward into the clearing. Daniel froze. "This place?" he whispered, stunned. "I haven't thought of it in years." "What happened here?" I asked quietly. Daniel shook his head slowly. "Nothing. Nothing that night. I never walked this far." But the tone of his voice said something else. Something heavier, something that felt like an old ache waking up. Danny walked toward the center of the clearing, turning slowly, scanning his surroundings as though expecting something to appear. His hand hovered again near his pocket, fingers brushing the shape of the metal object. "He's waiting," Daniel whispered. "He doesn't know for what, but he's waiting." "For her?" I asked. Daniel swallowed. His eyes locked on the boy. "No, that meeting came years later. This is something else." Danny suddenly crouched, touching the ground where the moonlight thinned. He brushed aside leaves, revealing a faint impression in the dirt. Something circular, shallow, long faded. Not a marking, not a symbol. A remnant of something that had once rested there. Daniel inhaled sharply. "I'd forgotten that." "What is it?" I asked. "A memory I buried," Daniel said. "Or one that slipped through a crack in my mind." His voice lowered. "This is where she once kept the box, before I ever knew her." I felt the back of my neck prickle. "You came here together?" I asked. "Years later," Daniel said, his throat tightening. "She brought me here one autumn afternoon and told me she left the box under this tree when she was younger. Said she came back for it the next day. Said no one ever knew it was here. And Danny is feeling that story without living it," I murmured. Daniel closed his eyes. He's feeling the pull of something that hasn't happened yet, the echo of a connection he hasn't made. Danny stood again, stepping away from the faint circle of disturbed earth. The wind shifted through the clearing, carrying a chill that felt deeper than temperature, like something old and invisible passing through. "He's sensing her," Daniel whispered. Not the girl she was then, the girl she'd be when he met her. His face twisted slightly, the memory cutting sharper, and the way losing her would change him. The clearing fell silent. Danny turned suddenly toward the mill road. He took a step, then another. "He's going somewhere he never went," Daniel said, panic threading into his voice. "This is beyond anything I knew. Should we stop him?" I asked. Daniel shook his head, eyes wide. "I don't know if we can." Danny reached the edge of the clearing. He paused, looked up, as if sensing something beyond sight, beyond comprehension, some presence woven through the night that neither belonged to his past nor his future. The woods held its breath. Daniel's voice trembled when he spoke again. "If he keeps going, he's stepping into a part of his life I never lived, a part I never remembered, something that shouldn't exist." Danny took one more step, and the world around us seemed to tighten, drawing in the moment like a held breath waiting to break. Danny stepped beyond the clearing, crossing the threshold between the trees and the faint outline of the mill road as though pulled by something neither of us could see. The night around him felt charged, too still, too expectant, as if the air recognized the deviation before either version of Daniel could. Every sound seemed suspended. The breeze, the distant hum of the town, even our own footsteps. Only the crunch of leaves beneath Danny's shoes broke the silence. Daniel moved forward with a careful urgency, not daring to get too close. His eyes never left the boy, tracking each movement with equal parts dread and fascination. I could sense the tremor beneath his composure now, the realization that he was no longer following memory, but possibility. "He's crossing into a night I never lived," Daniel whispered. I didn't respond. The weight of those words pressed against my chest like something physical, something cold. Danny walked slowly down the mill road, his head tilted slightly as though listening for a sound that hadn't reached us yet. His hand rested over his pocket again, absorbing the outline of the object he had found, the lock fragment. Even in the dim light, I could see how tightly he held it. "Does he feel her?" I asked quietly. Daniel nodded, his jaw tensing. Not her exactly, the shape of her, the absence of her, years before she ever existed for him. His breath caught. He's stepping toward an emotion, without the memory that should anchor it. The mill road bent slightly to the right, leading toward the derelict service shed that had been abandoned since before I could remember. A loose metal panel clattered faintly in the breeze, breaking the stillness long enough for Danny to stop and look up. His posture stiffened, as if he sensed something waiting for him ahead. Daniel drew closer to me, not for comfort, nothing in him sought comfort, but to steady himself. "He shouldn't be here," he whispered. "This place never belonged to him." "Then why does he look like he recognizes it?" I asked. Daniel swallowed. "Because in a different version of his life, she could have brought him here too." We approached the bend cautiously, the old mill looming like a dark skeleton against the sky. Danny walked along the side of the structure, brushing his hand across the corrugated metal, leaving faint trails in the dust. He paused at the corner, leaning forward slightly as if listening. Then he stepped inside the shed's open doorway. Daniel froze. "No," he breathed. He never came in here. Not in any memory I have." "What's inside?" I asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. His face tightened, lines deepening with a mix of fear and recognition. "A place she told me about once," he said finally. "She hid something here when she was young, something that mattered to her." "And he's feeling that story early," I said, "before he ever meets her." Daniel nodded slowly. "He's moving through echoes of a future he hasn't lived, and that can distort a person." Inside the shed, Danny stopped in a small clearing of moonlight where the roof had partially caved. Dust floated through the beam of light like drifting ash. The shed smelled of old rope, rust, and forgotten things. Danny's expression changed, confusion deepening into something heavier, a mixture of curiosity and sorrow he couldn't name. Daniel stepped forward, almost involuntarily. "This is where she kept the box before she moved it to the clearing," he whispered. "I never saw this place. She only described it to me, and he He's walking through her memories. But how? I asked. How can he feel something that hasn't happened yet? Daniel closed his eyes, exhaling shakily. Because connection leaves an imprint outside of time. We feel the shape of people long before we know their names. Danny knelt near the collapsed beam, brushing aside debris. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of a feeling too large for his age. When he lifted his head again, I saw it clearly. He looked lonely in a way that had nothing to do with being alone. Daniel whispered, "This is the beginning of everything that would matter to him, and everything that would break him later." Danny stood suddenly, chest rising unevenly. He wasn't searching anymore. He was sensing something, someone, a future that had reached back before it was supposed to. Daniel stepped back, breath unsteady. "He's too young to feel this," he said. "He won't know what to do with it." And as Danny turned toward the shed's entrance, the object in his pocket glinting faintly, I realized that whatever he felt tonight would follow him through the coming years, a shadow growing quietly behind him, a shadow Daniel had carried all his life. Danny stepped out of the shed with a sudden urgency, as though the air inside had grown too heavy for him to breathe. He paused at the threshold, gripping the doorframe with one hand, while the other pressed tightly over the object in his pocket. For a moment he looked as if he might collapse under the weight of something he couldn't name. Then he straightened abruptly and turned back toward the mill road, walking faster than before. Daniel followed him, but not with the same tentative steps he'd taken earlier. Something in him had shifted, an awareness that whatever the boy was experiencing had begun drifting toward a part of his life that Daniel had never examined closely. He stayed a few paces behind Danny, his eyes wide with a kind of stunned recognition. "He's feeling the echo of her grief," Daniel said in a low voice. "The grief she carried when she hid that box. He doesn't know it yet, but he's feeling the residue of someone else's sorrow." "Is that even possible?" I asked. Daniel's expression tightened. "Emotion leaves traces, even when the memory hasn't happened, even when the moment belongs to someone else. He's touching something that wasn't meant for him tonight." Danny slowed as he reached a section of the road where the trees thinned and the faint glow of a distant street lamp spilled over the cracked asphalt. He stopped just beyond the pool of light and turned his face upward, as though searching the sky for a shape he expected to find. The wind caught his hair, lifting it gently, but he didn't react. His hand stayed over his pocket. "He's trying to understand the feeling," Daniel whispered, "trying to find a name for something that's arriving too early." The boy's chest rose and fell unevenly. He looked lost, truly lost, in a way that wasn't about direction or geography, but about the sudden pull of a life he hadn't lived yet, the ache of an attachment he hadn't formed, the shadow of a loss that hadn't happened. Daniel's voice softened. "I remember being restless that night, but I never remembered this depth, this confusion. I thought I was just a frustrated kid. I didn't understand how close I was to a life that would shape me." Danny took a step toward the street lamp as if drawn to its warmth. The faint light revealed the tension in his posture, his shoulders rigid, his jaw tight, his eyes unfocused. He looked like a boy standing on the edge of something invisible. "What does this night become for him?" I asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. "A before, nothing more. He was supposed to walk home with a heaviness he couldn't explain, and that would have been the end of it." His voice wavered. "But now, he's feeling pieces of her before they ever meet. Emotions without context. That kind of weight can bend a person." Danny suddenly stepped backward, away from the light, his breath catching. Something inside him had shifted. He didn't look scared, but shaken, like he had heard a quiet truth whispered somewhere inside the night. "He felt her," Daniel whispered. "Not in a way he understands, not in a way he ever will, but he felt the outline of her sadness." "How do you know?" I asked. Daniel's gaze hardened, not with anger, but with memory. "Because years later, when she told me about that night she hid the box, I felt this same pull, this same ache, and I didn't understand why it lodged so deeply in me." He tapped his chest gently, "But it was because part of me already knew that place, already lived it." The wind rustled the leaves around us, scattering them across the road like fragments of lost pages. Danny walked forward again, but slower this time, as if carrying a weight that didn't fully belong to him. "He's too young to carry something that belongs to another person's sorrow," Daniel said. "And yet, maybe that's what shaped who he became." Danny reached the edge of the woods again. Instead of returning to the yard or the path home, He turned in a direction neither of us expected, a dirt trail I didn't even know connected to the mill road. Daniel inhaled sharply. He never walked that way. Not once in my memory. "What's there?" I asked. Daniel swallowed. "Nothing. At least, nothing for him. Not that night." But Danny kept walking. And for the first time since the evening began, Daniel looked genuinely afraid. Not for the boy, but for the version of himself he would wake up as tomorrow. Danny followed the narrow dirt trail with the uneven steps of someone moving toward an answer they didn't ask for. The woods around him grew denser, the air colder, as though the night thickened the farther he walked. The moon barely reached through the branches here, leaving only faint streaks of light on the worn path. Daniel slowed, watching closely, his breath shallow, the glove on his left hand twitching slightly, as if trying to hold something together inside him. "He never came here," Daniel murmured. "Not once. I never set foot on this trail. Why is he—" He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing as he looked farther down the path. His expression changed. Not shock, not fear, but a kind of recognition that unsettled me more than either. "What?" I asked. "Do you remember something?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer to the path, squinting through the darkness at a faint clearing ahead. "I knew this place," he finally whispered. "Not from that night, but from years later, when she told me where she used to walk when she was younger." A cold prickle slid down my spine. "He's following her memory," I said. "No," Daniel said softly. "He's following a version of himself shaped by her." Danny reached the clearing, a small circular patch of earth surrounded by tall grass, quiet and still except for the slow sway of branches above. He turned in a slow circle, breathing heavily, as though trying to recognize a place he had never seen. The object in his pocket weighed visibly on him now, pulling his shoulders down, anchoring him to something he didn't understand. Daniel stepped forward, unable to stay back. His voice cracked when he spoke. This was her refuge. Before she met me, before she trusted anyone, she came here to think, to hide, to cry. She left pieces of herself in places no one else noticed. And Danny is feeling those pieces, I whispered. Daniel nodded slowly, painfully. It shouldn't be possible. But grief, connection, the things we carry, they don't always belong to time. They echo. Danny moved toward the center of the clearing, stopping at a patch of disturbed earth, the faint indentation of something that had once rested there long before he ever knew her name. He crouched, brushing his palm slowly across the ground, tracing a shape only he could sense. His voice broke the silence. A single, unsteady word. Why? The question wasn't directed at anyone. Not me. Not Daniel. It came from a place so deep and unexplored that even he seemed startled by it. He sat back on his heels, chest rising and falling quickly, eyes shining with something fragile and confused. Daniel clenched his jaw. He's asking a question he won't understand for years. "What question?" I asked. Daniel's voice was barely audible. Why he feels tied to someone he hasn't met yet. Why sorrow feels familiar. Why he's drawn to a moment that doesn't belong to him. Danny stood suddenly, wiping the back of his hand under his eyes. Though there were no tears, only the unsettled weight of emotion without context. He turned toward the trees again, taking a step back toward the path, as though instinct finally urged him home. But Daniel didn't move. His breath caught in a painful tremor. "Do you see it?" "See what?" "How lost he is," Daniel whispered. "How young, how unprepared for everything that comes later." There was no bitterness in his voice, only sorrow, the quiet kind that grows from witnessing the earliest fracture of a life you once lived. Danny stood still, the wind brushing through his hair, carrying with it the cold scent of the woods and the faint rustle of branches overhead. "He won't remember this night clearly," Daniel said, "but he'll carry the ache of it. He'll think it came from nowhere." "And you?" I asked. "Will you remember this differently now?" Daniel's eyes softened, the first hint of something like peace touching his features. I came back to watch a moment from my past. He swallowed, but what I found was the beginning of someone I didn't know I used to be. Danny took a final step toward the trail home. The clearing behind him felt altered, quieter, as if the night had closed a door only he had heard open. Daniel exhaled. "He's ready to go back now." "You sound relieved," I said. Daniel shook his head gently. not relieved, just ready for the first time. We followed the boy as he walked toward the path that would eventually lead him home, carrying the weight of a future he didn't understand and a memory that had not yet formed. I've replayed that night in my mind more times than I'm willing to admit. Not because I want to change anything. Daniel was right about that. The past doesn't bend for our wishes. It bends for its own quiet reasons, in its own quiet hours. But I return to it because of the way he looked at his younger self walking back toward town. There was no judgment in him, no frustration, only a long, steady grief for the boy he once was, and a gentleness he never knew how to offer himself back then. Danny disappeared into the edge of the trees, carrying the weight of a feeling he wouldn't understand for years. And Daniel stood there, watching the shadow of his own life turn in a direction he hadn't expected. When he finally stepped away, he didn't seem older or wiser, just lighter, as if witnessing the cracks in his past had given him permission to stop holding them so tightly. We walked in silence until the woods thinned and the familiar shapes of town returned. The street lamps glowed softly along the road, indifferent to what the night had revealed. Daniel paused once, glancing toward the ridge where the evening had begun, then nodded to himself as though recognizing something he'd missed before. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet certainty. "Memories aren't wrong," he said. "They're incomplete. We fill the spaces with what we can live with." I didn't know what became of him after that. He left before dawn, stepping back into whatever year had carried him here. But sometimes, when I pass the rail yard or see the moon settle low above the old trees, I think about the boy he once was, walking home under a sky he didn't know how to read yet, and the man who returned only to watch him take his first uncertain steps toward a future they both still carry.